In this week's video, I'm going to explain how to knit fingerless mitts without a pattern. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles of each section and their respective starting points. This video contains a lot of information and at times refers to techniques that are not explicitly demonstrated in the video. There's a ton of information down in the video description that can help you fill in any gaps that you might have. These are 3 different fingerless mitts that I have knit, and I use different yarn weights for each one. Yarn weight meaning yarn thicknesses. Each of these different yarns require a different needle and the stitch size is different. Knitting without a pattern is the ability to knit a garment or accessory by understanding what the component parts of that garment are and how each of them are constructed. So you combine the measurements you have, the size that you want to achieve, with the specific yarn you are using and the gauge that you get with that yarn, and you combine those together to figure out how many stitches you need to cast on, how to do the shaping over a certain period of time if you need to add increases or decreases over a certain period of time, and how to transition from each of those component parts to another. So what I'm going to show you today is what the different component parts are of a fingerless mitt, how they're constructed, and then I'm going to walk you through the process of knitting a custom fit mitten for me using a yarn. So the idea here is that you can decide you want to knit a pair of fingerless mitts for a specific person, take their measurements, select a specific yarn that you want to use, discover what your gauge is for that, and then make a plan that you can then execute to knit a pair of fingerless mitts that has the different features and customizations that you would like to have for that person. A fingerless mitt has 4 different components. The first component is the cuff that is typically knit with ribbing. That's the part that hugs your wrist right here. The next component of a fingerless mitt is the thumb gusset. So you're working the hand, you transition to stockinette and you're working the hand, but you're at the same time that you're working the hand, you are making increases to make an allowance for the fact that your hand gets larger as your thumb starts to extend out from your hand. So that's the second component of the fingerless mitt. When you get to that point where the thumb separates from the hand, the stitches that you have created for the thumb will be put on hold. We'll put them on waste yarn or a stitch holder of some kind, and those will just sit there. And then we will return to working with the original number of stitches that we cast on, and we will complete the upper part of the hand to the length that we would like. Then the fourth part of a fingerless mitt is working the thumb from that separation point to the end. So the part that hugs your thumb from that point of separation up to however long you want it on your hand. So there are 2 measurements that are critical for a fingerless mitt, and the first one is the circumference of the hand above the point where the thumb separates. So you take a measuring tape and you measure around that circumference. So for me, that is 7 inches. The next thing to do is to take a tracing of the hand. And this is important, especially important if you are knitting for someone else and they aren't going to be around you, or you're knitting for somebody who isn't around you even to measure. They can do this part of the step themselves and then send this to you. So you want to trace around your hand. You want to, from your wrist below, a little bit below your wrist, all the way around the top of your hand, like this. And before you take your hand off the paper, you mark where your wrist actually is, like that. So what we can do right away on this piece of paper is write down what the circumference is so that we don't forget that. So the measurement the second measurement that is really critical is this distance between where the thumb separates and the wrist, because that is going to determine how long the mitten is between where the ribbing ends and where the thumb separates. So this is the measurement that we need to take right now. So these two measurements are critical. If you are knitting for somebody else, you might want to discuss with them how long, like where on their hand do they want the mitt to end. And likewise, I would say discuss where on the thumb that they would like the mitt to end. So if they want it to end like right below their thumbnail, then you could mark that right there. If they want it to be below their knuckle, you could mark that as well. Then the next thing to discuss is how long do they want the mitt to sit on their cuff. Typical would be 2 to 3 inches, but some people might want something that's longer or might want something that's long and can flip back. So you need to discuss that with them as well. So again, the two critical measurements are the circumference around the hand, right above the thumb, and then this measurement from where the thumb separates down to the wrist. For me, this measurement is 2.75 inches. The next stage is to select the yarn that you want to use for these mitts. So every yarn is going to have a different recommended gauge depending on how thick or thin it is. So you want to look at the yarn label and see what it is recommending for the gauge. So this yarn label says 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And then it's recommending a needle of a US 7 or 4.5 millimeter needle to get that gauge. So this is the yarn that I am going to be using for my mitt. And I did my gauge swatch using what it's called a fake in the round swatch. So when I'm knitting my mitt, I'm going to be knitting in the round and the knit side is always going to be facing me. So when I do my gauge swatch, I want to make sure that I am at least simulating what's going to happen when I'm knitting the real thing. Some knitters have a looser purl gauge than stitch gauge, so if they knit their swatch flat, but they knit their project in the round, the gauges aren't going to match. So I have a video that I will link to up here on how to knit this kind of a swatch that allows you to fake an in the round swatch. So you knit across a knit row, and when you finish it, you drape this yarn very loosely across the back, and then you start again at the beginning of the row. So you need a circular needle or double pointed needles in order to use this technique. But again, I will link to it above, and it will also be a link in the video description. If you are using a thin yarn, like a fingering weight yarn that calls for around 7 stitches per inch, all the way up to, say, a worsted weight yarn, which might call for about 5 stitches per inch. If you're using something in the light to medium range of yarns, what you want to do is to cast on enough stitches to match the circumference of your hand. So I know that my hand is 7 inches in circumference. And my gauge for the yarn that I'm using, which is a DK weight yarn, is 5.5 stitches per inch. I can multiply those two things together and I can discover that what I need to get a mitt that's exactly the same size as my hand is something that's 38.5 stitches. Obviously, that isn't possible. I have to use a whole number. So the next thing to think about is what sort of ribbing do I want to use for my cuff? And that will help me finalize the number of stitches that I would actually want to cast on. I want to use a ribbing pattern that it has a multiple of 4. I want to use knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. So that means I need to have a multiple of 4 stitches in order to have the stitch pattern remain consistent for the entire round. So I either need 36 stitches or I need 40. So I am going to go up to 40. I'm going to make that decision to go up to 40 stitches. So this is my cast on number, is 40 stitches, and I'm going to be working knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. The next thing to figure out is what the circumference of my thumb is going to be when I actually am knitting just the thumb part that's not connected anymore to the hand. And for that, I want to use 40% of what my cast on number is. So I want 40 stitches times 0.4, that will give me 40%. So I'm going to want 16 stitches for my thumb. So I have a multiple of 4 stitches for my thumb, so that works really well for my ribbing pattern. This is a yarn that's kind of right on the edge of bulky and super bulky. If you are using a yarn like this, you want to make the circumference of your mitt a little bit larger, 10 to 15% larger than your hand. And the reason is that the stitches are thick. So the outside circumference of your mitten, if you had it be 7 inches around, the inside is going to be smaller than that. So it might just feel too tight. And that is particularly true around the thumb, which doesn't have very many stitches to begin with. And then you would be crowding it with this thick wall inside. So what I like to do for a thick yarn like this is to go up to a larger size, and that way it makes the inside circumference of the mitten actually fit my hand. So I want to walk through what the process would be for this type of mitten. The yarn that I was using for that mitten, I was getting 3 stitches per inch for that. I decided to make my mitten 8 inches in circumference rather than 7 inches, and I multiplied my 3 stitches per inch, and that gave me 24 stitches for the hand, and then 24 times 0.4 for the thumb is like 9.6. So I decided to have 10 stitches for my thumb. The first step of knitting the fingerless mitt is very simple. You've calculated the number of stitches that you needed and you figured out what kind of ribbing you want. So use whatever cast on method you like to produce an edge. I used a long tail cast on here, and then I cast on my 40 stitches and I worked for a few inches. I worked it until I got a length that I thought I would want for a fingerless mitt. In this case, it's somewhere between 2.5 and 3 inches long. So what I'm going to do at each step of knitting this mitten, if I'm making decisions and trying it on and saying, I guess I want it a little longer, is to keep notes. So how long did you actually make any particular section? So I'm going to make a note that when I knit this first cuff, that was 20 rounds long. I'll make a note of that so that when I knit the second one, I'll knit it exactly the same. The next component of the fingerless mitt is the section where we create the thumb gusset. So we're transitioning from the ribbing into stockinette, and then we are also going to be doing regular increases over the course of all of the rounds that are needed to create this length until we get to the separation point of the thumb. And we need to create those increases regularly until we have almost the number of stitches that we are going to need when we work the actual thumb. So I have all of my stitches on the needle, and I'm using a technique called magic loop. So I have the first half of the round on one needle and the second half on another. You could be using the 2 circulars method. You could be using a 9-inch circular. You could be using double points. You could be using any method that you choose to knit a small circumference in the round. What you need to know right now, though, is where the beginning of the round is and where the midpoint of the round is. So what you're going to do is you're going to place a marker right before the last stitch of the first half of the round. So I'm going to put an orange marker right here. And then I'm going to put a second marker after the first stitch of the second half of the round. So I'm going to pull this cord just so that you can see what's going on. So this is the middle of the round right here in between these 2 stitches. So we're creating the base of the thumb gusset using 2 existing stitches right in the middle of the round. And every time we increase, we're going to work the first increase right after this orange marker, and then we're going to work the next increase right before this green one. So we're going to be doing these increases in pairs. We're starting with 2 existing stitches, and then we're going to increase regularly in pairs until we have the total number of stitches that we need for the thumb minus 2. So if you look at this, I need 16 stitches when I work the thumb, but I'm going to end my thumb gusset with 2 stitches less. I'm going to have 14 stitches at the top. I'm starting the gusset with 2 existing stitches. That means I need 12 increases altogether, and because I'm doing them in pairs, I need 6 increase rounds. So now we need to figure out how many rounds do I actually need in the gusset. Well, we use the actual length that I need, which is 2.75 inches, and then we multiply that by my row gauge. So because I've just completed the cuff, I can measure a 2 inches right here and find out that I have 15 rounds in 2 inches. So that means I have 7.5 rounds per inch. So I multiply the gusset length I need by the number of rounds I have in each inch, and that gives me 20.625 rounds, but obviously I can't do that, so I rounded down to 20 rounds. So the entire gusset's going to be 20 rounds long. I'm going to have 6 increase rounds, so I need to distribute the other 14 rounds evenly. But I also need to make sure that I have at least 1 plain stockinette round after the ribbing and before I do the first increase, and 1 plain stockinette round after I work the last increase and before I actually divide for the thumb. In most cases, the increase for a gusset is going to need 2 or 3 plain rounds between each increase round. So if we have 6 rounds here, if we do 2 between each of these to start with, that's 10 rounds. So now I've got 16 rounds total that I've used up out of my 20 rounds. And remember, I need at least 1 plain round before and 1 after I work those, but because I have 4 rounds remaining that I need to distribute, I can put 2 rounds before I do my first increase round and 2 rounds after. So this happened to work out exactly evenly. It doesn't always. Sometimes you might have just 1 here and 1 there, or 1 in one place and 2 in another. Or you might need to add additional plain rounds or take away some plain rounds in some places. So if you are going to reduce the number of plain rounds between increased rounds, I would start with at the bottom so that you are increasing more quickly early on. If you need to add plain rounds to spread some more rounds out, I would add those at the top. So now I know what my plan is for the thumb gusset. It's to work 2 plain rounds, and then I'm going to work my first increase round, 2 plain rounds, increase, and so on until I've done all my increase rounds and 2 plain rounds afterwards, and I will then have 14 stitches on the needles. So I've worked my 2 plain rounds, and I'm going to work my first set of gusset increases. So here I am. I'm going to slip this marker, and then I am going to work my increase. So when you are doing paired increases like this, you want to use what are called mirrored increases. So you want increases can appear to lean in one direction or another. So you want one that leans left and one that leans right. My preference is to always lean toward the area that is changing in size, and since it's the gusset that is changing size and the rest of the hand is staying the same, I would use a left leaning increase after the orange marker, and I would use a right leaning increase before the green marker. But you don't have to do it that way. The point is to be consistent, to always use the same increase in the same place, and that they are mirrored. So I am going to use a make one left increase. So I'm going to lift this running thread up like this, and you can see that the strand is lying over the needle to the left. And I'm going to insert my working needle through that stitch so that it points to the left. The only way to do that is through the back of the stitch. So it's pointing to the left. It tells me I'm on track for a left leaning increase. And then I work this stitch. Doesn't matter if you hold the yarn in your right or left hand, you're pulling that stitch through. That creates a twisted stitch that angles to the left. I have a video on tips and tricks for make one increases that I will link to up here. So now I've knit that stitch. So now I'm going to knit this stitch, and now I want to do a make one right. Lift from front to back like you did with the make one left, only using your right hand needle because you're making a make one right. Lift it up and see how it's angled to the right. Pass it back over, and this time, in order to knit it so that it will twist, you need to insert your working needle through that stitch so that it will be angled to the right and so that that will twist, and you do that through the front this time. You see how it's angled to the right, and now you work your stitch whether you hold your yarn in the left or right hand, doesn't matter. Knit that stitch, pull the yarn through, and now you have done a make one right. This is only one type of increase that you could use, but it is one that is very typical. So I'm going to continue with my increases. The next 2 rounds are going to be plain rounds, and then I'm going to do another set of increases, and again I will do it right after the orange marker. I will do a make one left, and right before the green marker I will do a make one right, and I will do this until the total number of stitches I have between the markers is 14, which is 2 less than I need for my thumb later. So I have completed working the gusset increases, and I now have 14 stitches between the 2 markers, which is what I needed, 2 stitches less than the total number that I will need for the thumb. So now it's time to separate the thumb stitches off from the mitten and just continue on with the hand. So as you come to the marker, you take the marker off the needle, and then you take a yarn needle that has been threaded with a thinner yarn, nice smooth contrasting yarn, and you transfer all of the stitches that were between the markers onto this waste yarn. So now we have the thumb stitches on the needle. The working yarn is attached to the last stitch that we worked, and the second half of the round is over here. Now we've only have 38 stitches on the needle right now because we borrowed 2 stitches from the hand in order to establish the base of the thumb gusset. So what we need to do right now is replace those 2 stitches as part of the process of returning to knit in the round. So when we cast on stitches in the middle of a round, we need to cast them onto the needle where the working yarn is currently attached, which is the right hand needle. So if you use a method like the backwards loop, which places stitches on the right hand needle, you can do that right now. You can just put those stitches right on the needle like this, and then you can work the second half of the round as you would normally. But if you liked using a method like knitting on or the cable cast on, those methods put new stitches on the left hand needle, and currently the working yarn is attached to the right hand needle. So what you would do in that case is you would turn the work so that the wrong side was facing you. Then you could create 2 new stitches using knitting on or the cable cast on, whatever method you prefer. And once you had completed those 2 stitches, creating those new stitches, then you could turn the work so that the right hand side is facing you again. I'm going to use backwards loop cast on. And because I'm using this cast on and it's very easy for those stitches to stretch out, I'm going to start out by putting both of them on the same needle, and then after I've worked a few rounds, I'll move one of them to the other needle so that both needles have the same number of stitches. So now that I have reestablished working in the round with just the stitches I need for the hand, now I can knit this mitt until I get to the point where I want to start the ribbing. So that's going to be a personal choice depending on how long you want this mitt to be. You are going to need at least a ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch for the ribbing to provide enough ribbing that will prevent the stockinette from wanting to roll. So however long you want your mitt to be, subtract 3/4 of an inch from that, or at least a 1/2 inch before you start your ribbing. I finished working the hand straight up and did the ribbing and bound off, and now it's time to do the final component of the fingerless mitt, which is the thumb. So we have the 14 stitches that we put on waste yarn, and I need to recapture those stitches on my needles. So I've recaptured the stitches that were on waste yarn, and now it's time to work the thumb in the round. But we're still short 2 stitches. We have 14 stitches and we actually need 16 for the thumb. So that's where this cast on edge comes in, that was created when we replaced the 2 missing stitches from the hand and when we resumed working just the hand stitches in the round. Technically, all we need to do is pick up 2 stitches along that edge in order to give us the 16 stitches that we need. The problem is that when you have 2 sections that have been separated like this and you resume working in the round, there often are gaps that appear here between these 2 areas. So what I like to do is do a technique where instead of picking up the 2 stitches I need, I actually pick up 4 stitches along this edge. And then after I work the first round of those stitches, so as I come to the end of this first round here, I decrease one of the extra picked up stitches together with the last stitch at the original thumb stitches, and then I work the 2 stitches across here, and then I decrease that stitch here together with this stitch here. I have a technique video on how to make this happen that I will link to down in the video description. I now have 16 stitches. So I'm going to work the thumb to the length that I want it, and then I'll switch to ribbing for the last 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, depending on how long it is I want this thumb. So I finished this mitt. I just need to weave in the ends, and you can see where I worked those decreases. This is where the yarn tail was joined to the mitten, so that when that tail is woven in, that will be nice and tight. And then on this side, you can see that there's no gap. So that technique of picking up more stitches than you need and then decreasing out the extras in order to eliminate the gap is really useful. So now it's time to knit the second mitt, and hopefully you have taken notes on what you did in each section in terms of the number of stitches that you used, the number of increases that you made, and how many rows you worked at each point. You're going to knit the second mitt exactly the same as the first one because these are interchangeable mitts. This plain stockinette mitt is completely interchangeable as a right or left mitt. In this video, I demonstrated how to knit basic fingerless mitts that can be worn on either hand. I did not address how to knit right and left hand mitts that incorporate stitch patterns on the back of the hand and which place the thumb on the palm rather than at the midpoint of the round. That is a separate topic for another time. If you like this video, you might be interested in how to knit a hat without a pattern, or you might be interested in this playlist of techniques that pertain to knitting mittens. If you have any comments or questions about this video, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.